Bueno, arratsalde on danorik eta ongi etorriak gaurko saioara.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session of today. Welcome to the second session of the papers on this exhibition. As you know, this is a collaborative project between the Bulegoa and Azkuna Centroa, and its aim is to study exhibitions that have taken place between 1977 and 2017. So until now, there have been two encounters. This is the third encounter, or the third symposium. And the decade that we are addressing right now ranges between 1987 and 1997. So in this decade, well, the decade started with the inauguration of an important institution for the local context, which was Arteleku, and then it closed in 1997. That it coincided with the inauguration of another important institution for this context, although due to other reasons, and that is the Guggenheim Museum. Yesterday we had three guest speakers, and today we'll have another three guest speakers, and this morning some contributed papers were given. And yesterday we had Aymar Arriola speaking, and let's say that what he did was talk about the Carrying by Pepe Espadiu, and then we had Rachel Wace's presentation, and she focused on the third Biennale of Havana of 1989, and we finished with Joaquin Vázquez, who focused on two specific exhibitions that were organized by his company together with the curator, that is El Sueño Imperativo in 1991 and Plus Ultra from 1992. And my colleague Bea is now going to say a few things about what happened this morning in the contributed papers. Well, as you all know, those of you that have been at previous events, we have tried out different formats, and we've also held workshops with some of the people that had been invited. But this time, we also wanted to turn things around completely, and we wanted to focus much more on the present. And we wanted to use a completely different approach. So this is why we've had these contributed papers this morning, and a number of people have, were selected. We selected 6 proposals, and we wanted there to be enough time for a debate, for a dialogue, so that we could discuss different exhibitions, and also look into the past and the present too. And when you configure a program like this, you normally think about some big names, or people that have thought a lot about certain references, or that people that can awaken our interest in relation to these papers or these exhibitions that we'd selected. But we also know that there are lots of people that are working in other spheres. There are lots of young people involved that are researching these exhibitions and seen from the curatorial perspective. So this is why we wanted to hold this session. And then we were here this morning attending this session that was very intense. And although we had to rush out for lunch because we finished late, so I'm sorry that we couldn't allocate the same amount of time to all presentations for this afternoon. It's going to be dense, but I'm sure that we'll be able to recover some of the references that we mentioned this morning. But even so, we believe that it's going to be a format that we're going to continue with, because it's opened up a completely new perspective, because we are now working with younger people, and in other areas. Some areas are unknown to us, of course, and will possibly continue to with this kind of format. But in order to describe what we've worked on, although you can see the names of the speakers in the brochure, we also wanted you to bear in mind the exhibitions that we've reviewed, because we've been coming and going and referring to some very specific elements that were mentioned yesterday and that are going to be mentioned here now. So we kicked off with Alex Alonso with a presentation that's called Taxidermia en el Jardín del Edén, and that had to do with a critical analysis on the work of Emil Natter in 1989, and then Anita Orces introduced an analysis of the biennial network, so to speak, where she's established a connection between the Havana event in 1989 with the Venice Biennale of since 1974, with all the criticisms that were expressed. And the truth is that in the analysis, we looked into the biennial movement and its the criticisms and the possible improvements for exhibitions based on that particular notion. And then after that, Sheila Portilla has delivered an analysis on two exhibitions that had to do with AIDS, and they took place in 1991. One of them was organized by Blue Material and the one by Felix González Torres. And then after that, and this is when we were running out of time, because the truth is that everything was extremely interesting in the session, and Amaya Sánchez Sampedros spoke about Aperto 93 with a paper called De tropiezos, improvisaciones e imprevisibilidad, a propósito de cajas vacías en Alberto 93. And then Marion Cruza delivered a presentation that was based on the work by Chandal Ackerman, I think she said, in relation to the proposal that they made for the exhibition. And finally, Niertins and Marins de Oliveira has then, as you can see, we've ordered all of these presentations chronologically, and we spoke about the Sao Paulo biennial that took place in 1998. So you can see that the map that has been drawn up is much more thorough than what we initially considered, because it's been addressed from different points of view, from different angles, and it's also been supplemented by other analyses. And this is why we wanted to take these contributions into account. It seemed to be very specific this morning, but we believe that it is connected to what we're going to be discussing this afternoon. And we would like to thank the presenters for their interventions, because they've done some very hard work. And I think that's all from me for the time being. I think that we've already introduced everybody, and I think that the most interesting thing is that we move on to our speakers of this afternoon. As you know, it's Ines Xaver, Corinne de Sirens, and Catherine David. So what we are going to do is, you have the program here where you can see that Ines will be starting at 5:30, then 6:30 and 7:30, and the structure is going to be as follows. So first, we're going to introduce each of these speakers. We're going to give them the floor. They're going to deliver their presentations. And at the end of these three presentations, what we'll do is hold a conversation between them and us, and also with the audience. As I said, we're going to be kicking off with Ines Xaver, who's going to be talking about urban interventions, which is the workshop, and perhaps, it has to be pointed out in both languages, because later on she's going to be talking about bilingualism in this workshop that took place in 1994 at Artelecu, and that was directed by Antoni Muntadas, and of which Ines formed part. And she's going to be talking about her experience as a young artist that arrived in a context that she knew nothing about. And Ines Xaver is a writer and an artist. She lives in Berlin and Los Angeles, and she's currently a professor at Galatz. Her work addresses the complexity of the production of images by looking into historic experiences, and since 2004 she's been working for the Working Archive, which is a series of case studies and texts and artistic works through which she examines and tests notions of the archive. And, well, usually based on photographic records, but her often collaborative projects explore the construction of memory and how new readings are generated over time. And it has to be said too that this approach, or that this methodology that she works with, it seems to be very pertinent as regards this object of study that we've invited her to become involved in, so that she can go back and look at the past to discuss her participation in this workshop. So having said that, many thanks therefore to Ines for coming, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Miriam. Oh, this is very bright here. Oh, thank you. I need both. I will need both. I drink a lot. I'm very sick, so I need to drink a lot. Yes. Thank you. My Spanish is very bad. Sorry for not being able to speak in Spanish. From what I understand from Miriam, this was a really beautiful introduction, and you already understood that I'm not an academic in that sense here today, and that what I'm talking about is also not my research topic. I'm only talking about an experience that I had, which will be an experiment. And it was really, I think, a nice, provoking invitation that I received. I think, and I said yes immediately, not really understanding what I did, saying yes, because it kind of threw me back 25 years when I was quite young. And I had to really dig in my memory. But I also realized that it was actually a quite important month in my life, in my artistic development. So thank you guys for inviting me and forcing me to think back to that moment when I was very young, coming to Spain, speaking no Spanish. I also would really like to thank the people that we don't see, but that enable me speaking here in English. And I think it's Marian and Mike who will try to tell you what I'm saying. Okay. The whole thing is about my participation in the workshop called Urban Intervention that, as Miriam already said, it's always named as initiated by Muntadas, and I think that's quite important in a way that also marks the relationship he had to Arteleco as an institution, I think. But before I go more into that, I would like to do a couple of things to tell you more about me, and also to tell you what I think, why I'm here, and probably not somebody else. I'm also really sick, so my throat dries out really fast, so I will drink all the time. What I got really interested in the invitation was the concept of the 3 decades, and specifically what you named in the decade that you invited me to. And I think when I lived in that decade, I didn't realize what you were talking about. And if you did or didn't, I don't know. But I think the young artists, Spanish and Basque artists at the time in Arteleco, realized it extremely well. So it's interesting that I only understood what you're writing about today in the Basque country at the time. And I think it's worth repeating what you tried to do there to make clear also why I'm interested in that. You write first that the period between 87 and 97 is described as a time in which we could witness a contemporary art boom, in which the market value of living artist work rose. Contemporary art museums and biennials, large exhibitions proliferated all over the world, as well as a period in which museums and art institutions took on a central role in shaping a new financial model for cities as focal points of tourism. I think you're very well aware of that. I wasn't aware of that at all at the time. But the other point that I was really interested in, that was the model I was most familiar with at the same time myself, is that you made, and I'm probably interpreting that a little bit, is that there existed as well different forms of production and cultural representation, places that operated locally as well as tried to create and connect their local discourse to an international one. And that was probably what I think Arteleku stood very well for, and what was the experience that I made here. So both models today are quite present in my life, even though I didn't know about them at the time. And I try here to speak a little bit as a visual artist, so different than the other conversations. Probably for me, I would like to put the point about what does it mean to produce in these two kind of models for an artist, and what becomes of art if artists don't have the one or the other, or specifically if they don't have the other. What happens if there's no Arteleku? So I'll try to do that and not speak really about it, but wonder also where art production is going currently, and what we should do or try to do, and what cities should do. So I think it has always to do also what kind of art does a society want, what does it want from art, and how that influences art is also what they can produce, but also what they themselves can imagine to do or produce. So looking back, I think we didn't have the questions yet, but I think it was about to come at the time when I was at Arteleku. But I would like to first tell you where I came from. I'm not going to tell you where I come from today, because that's the story is too long. But I came from at the time, I think it's important because you didn't invite a Basque artist or a Spanish artist to speak. There are a couple of them. But I came from a very specific place in '94, which was Berlin. And I had moved to Berlin at the day the wall had come down, which was also my 20th birthday. And I had never intended to move to Berlin, but was kind of a cool birthday party, so I stayed. And it was a pretty exciting time, I think, for a young artist, but also it was a very crucial time, obviously, for an entire society. So if we think about the time period 87, 97, what we do here today, or in this weekend, or in these 2 days, for me it's definitely November '89. That is somehow a focal point, and everything that was before kind of moves toward, and everything is after is an effect from it. Maybe even today for me, we're still living in a post-fall of the wall time, at least in Berlin. And I'm always looking for images that somehow could represent the time. These images are from a photographer that doesn't live anymore. Her name is Ricky Kalbe, and they're closest to my kind of feeling about that time. When I moved to the East immediately, even before reunification, and I did that, I think, because the GDR opposition movement was really inviting young artists to join, and they were really curious what we were thinking. What we were thinking, what they were doing. Some of them were writing a new constitution. So it was kind of an exciting moment for artists to be there, and it was a very inviting society. Everything happened kind of on the street. And the GDR artists also represented a quite different model than the model of the artists I knew. That would be an entirely different lecture, what kind of model that is. But I find it really interesting how and in what way they participated in political discussions and actions. And I think this is kind of, even though I studied at an art academy, this is kind of my education. They always say it's like I'm one of their first students, kind of. I was taught by the opposition movement. So one of the works I did, and that's also, I think why Montadas invited me, was that I lived in a squat. There were many of them at that time. And we did facade theater to keep the idea of political action alive. And I also did this photographic installation that you can see on the right. So this is how I came to Bilbao. Living kind of really locally. So the house you can see is the house I did my artworks for, and I kind of, when I bought milk, we had discussions on the street, and the performances at night were also kind of part of that. The street, the opposition movement was kind of quite active, was the parallel street to this, so everybody was somehow around. So when I was invited to Bilbao, I was like, okay, that's really nice, thank you, but what should I do in Spain? Kind of, but I don't speak the language, I don't know the local context. What should I do there? So it was kind of this question of locality and internationality was a real challenge for me, because I had been operating very, very locally for about 5 years, which meant kind of a street corner for me. And I'm sure you all know what Arteleco was much better, but I found it's always worth just repeating and making it language in a space that what Arteleco on its website says about itself. And so I'm reading to you what's on the website, which I think is pretty well formulated. So there we can read. Arteleco was founded in 1987 by the provincial government of Guipúzcoa, and it ceased its activity in 2014. Back then, there wasn't any other such center in the Basque Country or in its immediate environment. It was aimed at meeting the existing needs, and since the very beginning, its work was rooted on art education and was developed through experimentation, artistic practice, and production. Arteleco, as the website further states, was a place for artists to work, meet and learn from each other and from different genres, but it was also a place to look into existing issues and debates in many fields of knowledge through workshops, seminars, and conferences. Urban interventions, the so-called workshops, a workshop I took part in, was, as I understood, the first in a series, right? So there came many afterwards. They had quite different formats, but it was always organized. There were a couple of Basque artists, a couple of Spanish artists, and a couple of international artists. 2 urban interventions, just to give you an idea, I found retrospectively it was really interesting. 25 artists were invited, 9 came from Spain, 4 of which were from the Basque Country, and 16 were international. We were connected to different art educational institutions, at least most of us, there are a few exceptions, through which Muntadas kind of in his endless walking through or kind of traveling through the world had found us. We lived in a hotel in shared rooms. We spent 4 weeks intensely with the subject and each other. We received an enormous amount of input. I think it was mainly, from what I remember, what was most impressive, that they really tried to tell us and teach us what is the Basque Country. So we had people trying to teach us that, but also the other artists from the Basque Country were kind of co-teaching. So we were constantly informed what are the current issues, what are the past issues. So they tried to bring us into specific politics of the Basque Country at the moment. And retrospectively, we had the luck that we had Caterina Borelli, a filmmaker, with us for the entire month, nearly the entire month, and she made a movie which I didn't like at the time because probably it was too close. But looking at it 25 years later, I think it's pretty amazing. It is extremely bad quality because it's transferred, it's shot on VHS, and I think often there's a camera sound. The resolution is really low, but it tells everything about the time in the quality and everything. I hope you can see something. I'll just as a kind of introduction to the atmosphere of her video, I'll show you a 2.5-minute excerpt of her way of introducing the workshop. So. So I hope this works. Can you turn the light down a little bit?
Tenemos que reaccionar a las presentaciones de qué manera la realidad del proyecto en sí, y luego yo creo que es importante que hable del contexto. Luego en el contexto del seminario sobre de una manera, yo no diría rápidas, pero inmediatas, el problema que hay.
I remember the years for me to touch this place
C'est une installation qui comprendra une photographie totale et une
Oops, sorry. We had, you could hear that's at least 5 languages at the time. I looked it up. We had Jose Maria Mendizabal, who was absolutely amazing. I think he could translate like 5 languages into other 5 languages simultaneously. And I don't know what would have happened to us without him. So there was, I mind us, all of us talking all the time at the same time, continuously, and him not being disturbed or making sense of all of it. Just to give you a little bit more information what actually happened, so we'd had individual presentations. One was by Montadas, whom you see with that very strong notion of contexto, el contexto, by the sociologist Jesus Apal, who mainly spoke about the current state of Basque cities, and then Vito Aconci, Federico Guzman, and Hans Hake, who came and spoke about their work. Most of them stayed for a couple of days, if not longer, so we had a kind of intense conversation with them as well. There was also a roundtable which was really well visited by other artists in the city, which was on a panel where Christoph Wodiczko and the architectural theorist Beatrice Colomina, the art and urbanism historian Ellen Turay, and it was moderated by Bartolomeo Marie. All of them also stayed longer. And then there was a film program. It's not actually true, but it felt like there was films every night. That was organized by Eugenie Bontek. And the idea of the workshop was that we present our work at the beginning and then make work during the month in relation to something in San Sebastian. As you could see from my work, for me, that was a pretty impossible brief, and I was kind of, okay, it was like, whatever. But for most of the artists, that framework of 1 month seemed to work quite well, and I'm going to show you a couple of excerpts, and that's it's interesting to look back at those works. I think it's really important to understand they were made in 1 month, not only conceptualized but also produced, so they're very quickly made. But it's also, I think, I don't know, Hake always spoke about us as the students, which we were. I think Montadas and Santi never would have used that work. They treated us as artists, and they produced the work as if we kind of are artists. So they had a pretty amazing stuff, and Alicia Chilida produced everything. She was absolutely amazing as well. So I don't know really how they managed to support the work of 25 people in that 1 month. Plus there were also kind of collaborations that happened, so it was more work that came. I'm going to show you 4 works. I selected those clips because they seem to make most sense in the video, not because I like them or like the people specifically well or something. I just like the thing that, like, in 1 minute clip works well. Could you turn down or dim the light again? Thank you. I'm sure you all know what NBP is, right? No, it's gonna go for a little bit. Please ding down.
Entonces consiste en tomar la señal que capta la cámara que está en la parte exterior de la biblioteca y que capta la entrada del público a la biblioteca. Esa imagen no es grabada, sino que en directo es pasada hasta el hall del edificio de correos y allí es proyectada mediante un videoproyector. Del mismo modo, repito el proceso grabando con la cámara de la entrada de correos y proyectando en el hall, que es este que se ve en esta diapositiva, del Coldo Michelet. Esta parte tiene lugar durante el día, a las horas que están abiertos ambos edificios al público. La segunda parte, denominado interior-exterior, porque las imágenes son captadas dentro de los edificios y son exhibidas en el exterior, en la calle, en la zona peatonal.
No? Two more. Thank you. It's nice though. One more. I hope it's clear roughly what they are they? Is it okay? You can say something more. Me regarde. Yes, please. So I think what you saw are mostly things that one could describe as interventions, urban interventions, and that was the idea. And I was thinking about, could one actually label it as an exhibition, as you kind of like to say, well, it was also an exhibition, and maybe one could, but I think there's also a question that I think what they were looking for, or what many of us were looking for, was kind of develop very different formats. And I think a lot of people were coming from different modes of experimentation where the exhibition format wasn't that interesting in that very moment, which is probably interesting because many people went back to it or did other things, but I think it was very decisively kind of a city, an intervention in the city, whatever that might mean. Even like, as you saw, like some were actually sculptural Others, I think, were really just walking across the street or knocking at the door or collecting something that was already there. So it was, I think, it was more about expanding that notion of exhibition. I'm not sure if the exhibition as a term was even used at the time. So I think it is interesting in other formats as well. When I think about all the current summer schools that are popping up in Europe, I think it was a very interesting model for a summer school. Once because it was fully funded by Arteleco, right? So it wasn't us paying Arteleco, but we were paid by Arteleco to come, which is a different thing, and we were treated like professionals, not like students to listen. It was really about producing something together also. So I think it's interesting to revisit Arteleco as a place, also as a place that I think was about, at the time at least, to really question all those categories, at least in my experience, in that 1 month. Or we could probably discuss further, and I have a very limited experience in that 1 month, of course. So many of us operated in relation to very specific sites or specific terms. There was something like the Basque woman, for example, was one field of research, but mostly it was actually sites that people were dealing with. And there was one site in San Sebastian that was kind of attractive for us to deal with because it was like right in front of our eyes, which was the Kursaal, which Moneo had just won the competition. So many of us worked around that area, and there's one project that I would like to show you by an architect who did somehow a research, like a public inquiry about the project, and there's one thing that came out of those discussions becoming somehow a collective action of a whole bunch of people. So I'm going to show you 2 more. Could you dim it again, please?
Que están fastidiando todo. Pues si lo cierran esto, te va a resultar que una playita tan cerca de todos los que hay aquí por alrededor, claro, les viene de maravilla, pues tienen que ir hasta casa de ellos. Claro.
So what you can read here is something I've been thinking about for a really long time, if I should talk about it or not. Because it's 25 years ago, and the discussion around the building of the Guggenheim has completely changed. But I felt also rethinking about urban inventions is completely impossible to not speak about the discussion at the time. And also, I think the anger that a lot of artists had, and the reservations most of the sociologists, anthropologists had, that were talking about it. And I think it was a very crucial moment in the Basque Country in that respect, and it was very defining for what we were talking about, and also maybe somehow taking over at a specific time. So I'm sorry I have to do this, but I decided I have to. And also because you were speaking about the question that there is this change in that period, in that decade, what art institutions mean, and probably even though you might be full over your head with discussions around the Guggenheim, there are a couple of things that I think are worth probably mentioning or rethinking, and also kind of I was hoping some of the Basque artists would still be here in that context and kind of could help me and what they would think about the Guggenheim today, but maybe you can step in. So I have more questions than answers. I'm just trying to let you know what happened at the time. So one day we had a visit to Bilbao, and I wasn't really understanding where we were going, but we were visiting the old city and we were going to the port, and it was, as you all know, it was a very black city. It was pretty polluted. And then we were also going to the Guggenheim. And we were going to the something like a, I think, planning office or something. And that was a very interesting moment. I'm showing you another clip. And I think in that clip one could also see kind of what the artists at the time were kind of thinking about it. So it's probably a reminder, probably it's completely, you think it's completely irrelevant, but that was what happened at the time.
Este cambio en la orientación económica del País Vasco, y desde el punto de vista formal y urbanístico el reflejo de ese cambio en la ciudad de Bilbao, donde es más perceptible, después es más perceptible ese cambio en cuanto a la estructura urbana de Bilbao, pues puede ser en este área que tenemos aquí detrás, que luego podéis ver más en el balcón. Esta es una zona que se denomina Bando Ibarra, es una zona que hasta el presente, incluso en la actualidad, ha sido utilizada para usos portuarios e industriales. Como consecuencia de la crisis industrial, se va desocupando un espacio que el Plan General de Bilbao prevé recuperar para la ciudad y dedicarlo fundamentalmente a usos de equipamientos culturales, de expansión del parque, de actividades de ocio y también de desarrollo residencial y terciario en una pequeña parte. Esos proyectos quizás que ha tenido una visualización mayor, una polémica también mayor, y es un proyecto que surge de esa iniciativa de intentar tener en el País Vasco una institución cultural cuya actividad tiene una proyección, una dimensión y un enfoque internacional europeo y no únicamente local o regional.
La compra, la administración, la programación, de todo esto que se deja en manos de la GUE, que gestionará, que programará enteramente todo eso, ¿no se mantiene o ese convenio no rige ya?
No, como antes he dicho, la Fundación Guggenheim, en virtud de ese acuerdo, está comprometida para participar en todos lo que son aspectos técnicos de gestión del museo bajo los criterios
de asesoramiento.
participación en la gestión del museo bajo la supervisión o bajo las directrices de esa fundación que será la que formalmente tenga la responsabilidad de esto. Los aspectos de compra, yo creo que son aspectos que antes no hemos hablado, es decir, la colección que va a existir en este museo va a ser fundamentalmente, por poner porcentajes, en un 90% la que provenga de ese acuerdo de la colección de las propias colecciones de Guggenheim, pero además el museo aspira a tener una colección propia. Esa colección todavía no se ha iniciado, todavía no ha habido ninguna adquisición de obra de ningún artista, pero en principio está previsto que sí se vaya desarrollando.
Recordemos que más de 450 intelectuales, artistas y de alguna manera agentes culturales se reunieron y construyeron una plataforma que sobre todo se fijó un cambio de orientación brusco en la línea de la política cultural, por decir así, o de repente se encontraron sin los caminos habituales de solución, etcétera, pero sobre todo porque se desecuestró todo el debate del proyecto, es decir, no fueron considerados, no fueron consultados, etcétera. Han sido preguntadas para la pregunta de cómo ha sido recibido el proyecto aquí, pues creo que se va a hacer.
Es que me ha dicho desde el punto de vista del público y luego desde el punto de vista de los artistas. He hablado del público, pero me ha olvidado de los artistas. No ha sido por una visita de todo. Desde el punto de vista de los artistas, eso es verdad, yo creo que ha habido gente que se ha manifestado en contra y gente que se ha manifestado a favor, tibiamente a favor. Bueno, yo creo que esa es una reacción constatable.
Y observamos un grupo de artistas con independencia ya de la visita, de la ley y tal, preparamos una obra de arte basada en las teorías de Walter Benjamin y la técnica que queremos enseñar aquí un poco con nuestra opinión respecto al tema este de la oposición. Esperemos que esto no sé si para la selección o para la europea, pero es una primera pieza con la cual se elaborar los fondos.
So probably you haven't seen that one yet. I think the concern of most of the artists was that it was completely unclear what would happen to Basque funding for art at the time, with the Guggenheim not signaling any kind of connection to exhibiting Basque artists and the Basque government not giving any clear indications of how they would keep on funding Basque art. So there was, I think, quite some insecurity, or I wouldn't say fear, but there was anger, I think, in the room, and skepticism, of course. So that was quite interesting. And Berlin wasn't there yet. We came to it much later. So it was, I was well prepared when it started. What is not in the video, strangely, I don't know, but it's in like very vivid in my memory, is Hans Hake listening to what we have just seen, hiding in the back of the room, and then he started a pretty massive attack on the institution of the Guggenheim. And as you all know, he had some relationships with the Guggenheim, specifically around the cancellation of his solo show in '71 already. So we're talking here in 25-year steps somehow. It was canceled in '71, and he was talking to them. We were kind of here in '94, and we're another 25 years later, so things go slowly, fortunately. But I just felt it's nice to remember that work, why his exhibition was cancelled, and his position towards it, although we're today quite well known, but to this kind of approach, but to think about added in '71, I think, was quite unusual. So his Chalposky work, which in excerpts looks like this. It had these two elements, exposes the properties and transactions of the biggest real estate group in New York at the time in framing the fundamental contradiction of the real estate system, the opposition between market requirements and social needs of the city residents. I'm just giving you a very brief, as I think you all know it well. But But as the work was part of Harke's plan for his solo show, and Messer, the director of the Guggenheim at the time, asked him to take it down, and Harke refused. The show was cancelled, and the specific curator was also fired. So it was interesting, I think, that Harke had some quite direct experiences with the Guggenheim, also about the freedom of artists to actually do critique. So when he stand in the back of the room, I think that was probably also on his mind. But also throughout his career, Harke had been outspoken about demystifying the relationship between museums and businesses. He writes, "What we have here is a real exchange of capital, financial on the part of the sponsors and symbolic on the part of the sponsored." He underlines the idea that corporate sponsorship of art enhances the sponsoring corporation's public reputation, which is of material use to them. He believes that both parties are aware of this exchange, and as an artist, he intends to make the relationship visible. And I mean, yes, right? We know that. But I think he's still one who actually does expose that, and also does not always think this is natural as a process where art tends to move to. So he was standing there back in a room and started talking, and people were kind of irritated. And he was very sharp in analysis, and I think he also knew a lot more about the kind of business of the Guggenheim than the people of the office so they were kind of a little bit cornered too, that they weren't really happy about. And he specifically, from what I remember, focused on 2 points. One was the figure of Krenz, the then director of the Guggenheim, and according to Harke, a high-stakes gambler who landed a good deal in Bilbao. And then the question of funding of the city of Guggenheim, that was also, I think, where the T-shirt kind of came from. That is also so common here in these discussions. I think it would probably be interesting with people who had that moment at the time to go back and revisit. In a later text, which I think is interesting, and there's a whole book on the Guggenheim effect and a conference that happened in Nevada and Reno at the Center of Basque Studies. So all of them were kind of there. So I think it's a nice book, but it's very much Guggenheim, right? But still, besides the critique that he stated in '94, I found an interesting quote that I would like to read to you about what he said there retrospectively in 2005. He writes, "I was one of those who believed that in this deal the Basque could only lose and the Guggenheim could only win. But both parties were desperate. Once prosperous Bilbao was crippled by the closing of the steel plants and the demise of attending industries and its formerly busy port. The Basque hoped that the importation of the Guggenheim Museum's cultural capital would promote urban development, give Bilbao a positive image, attract tourists from all over the world, and thus be a boom on the local service industry. It now appears that the Basque government had indeed made a profitable investment. Whatever one thinks about its suitability of the presentation of artworks and its ranking in the pantheon of architecture, it appears to perform the economic and political purpose for which the Basque government spent considerable amounts of taxpayers' money." So I found it interesting that that's like his 25-year after conclusion, or 15-year after conclusion. And that's the much critiqued process that has been kind of declared successful, and I think, like most agree, that from what was planned, it was amazingly successful, and there are probably other aspects that are not so much talked about, with curators and museum directors proving that they can turn cultural capital into monetary capital, as Harke writes, and this was, in his text, made again present in 2005. But I was also interested in another critique of their book, and it has nothing to do with the workshop, and is somehow, I think, brought me back to something different and back to Arteleku from that discussion. And it was a text by Lucy Lippert called On Not Having Seen the Guggenheim. I'm not sure of how many of you have read that text, but it's kind of a short story about her being in Spain and having the chance to actually finally see the Guggenheim, and then deciding that she would not go and see the Guggenheim but go to a little town called Galisteo, because only it has the same name that the town she lives in New Mexico. So she detours, goes to Galisteo, Spain, and her lecture is a little bit about the Guggenheim, but it's mostly a comparison of of Galisteo, Spain, and Galisteo, New Mexico, which is kind of beautiful. Also, I think her explanation is quite nice, that I'm going to read you as well, because it somehow explains why she does it. So to bring this talking to circles, back to the beginning, she writes, not having seen the Bilbao Guggenheim has been a liberating experience. Even though I'm beginning to feel like the old lady trying to hold back progress, it's allowed me to conflate the role of the art critic and the tour guide, and to give you a glimpse of two places you will probably never see. For all of you who don't know the text or the book, I think it's quite like it's a Bible for Bilbao populations or citizens to think about it. I like the discursive move out in that very moment whenever it is possibly needed. But the lesson that she taught me as well, and I'm not decided, and that's probably something I would really be interested in discussing it with you, that besides there is a very necessary critique of the relationship that has developed in that period, but ever since then, between economy, city development, art, we also need to acknowledge that all those voices and places that fall off the grid in relation to those quite dominant discourses. And Galisteo, Spain, I think, is one such space that probably falls off the grid, but I think maybe Artileco might be one as well. And I think we do need these different stories of those different places. Today, probably much more than in '94. Libert reminded me as well that it's important to understand that the power of the discourse of the Guggenheim can be overwhelming. And defining what one talks about, they can also make us forget to speak about other things that are not so obvious to talk about. And I was very happy yesterday that the Guggenheim wasn't even mentioned once. And I was like, oh no, it's me who's going to say it, oh no. But I think it was very important what happened yesterday, and I'm sure it's thereafter, to think about these different formats of productions that are still somehow present, and that still kind of are worth kind of fighting for, remembering, articulating, and I think that's probably what all your research is. And for me as an artist, that doesn't just have to do, which is a lot as well, but just history, but it really defines, I think, the means of production for artists. So it's very important to keep in mind what they are able to produce and what they're not. I think it's absolutely crucial for any creativity of a society. I rewrote my end, so I'm going to read you the end, which, through the generous invitation to rethink the workshop at the time, I was reminded of an institution that was kind of relevant for me, even though I had forgotten about it. I'm not sure, and I do not want to generalize it, but I do think urban interventions was only possible because of Artileco, and because of quite amazing collaboration between three people, which were Santi Eraso, Montadas, and Alicia Chilida. And I think that is also not very common. So it was a wild combination of interesting people. Besides the need of an institution to be self-critical and aware of what it excludes, as Joaquin stated so beautifully yesterday, I would also like to add that institutions need a space for this outside to be invited in, or to even appear unexpectedly, something that negotiates the institution's very own borders and discourses. And I think at the time, this was what Artileco was based on. I have just one more clip, and then that's it. Thank you. You have the two-question thing, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Bueno, si alguien quiere...
Well, before I said that we were going to move on to the next speaker, but let's have a couple of questions if anybody has them, if anybody wants to ask them, please.
I have more questions than you probably, because I'm the actual outsider, but my questions are a little bit big because I haven't been here for 25 years, so I would prefer to ask my questions in a different setting. I've started with that before, but if you have a question, one that's not about how much the workshop costs or something.
Shall I ask this question in Spanish? Well, this has to do with the exhibition idea and how you refer to urban interventions, to the urban interventions that you carried out as a part of the workshop that in a way went beyond the workshop format and will engage with the production times that you pointed out before. So in other words, not only as a student but also as a professional, as artists that were already working. And was this one of the issues that you discussed? In other words, you said that this exhibition, well, you said that the exhibition concept at that point in time was not that present, or it was not such a key format for you people as artists. And if this was not the format, which format was the key format or the core format for you people?
I think exhibition was not a term that was really used. I think it was also urban interventions, which one could argue that is an exhibition format, right? I think it was decisively used at not an exhibition format, but an interventionist format. And that's how it was used, even though there was an exhibition at the end for people like me who didn't make an intervention, right? Because they were more like gathering information also. I think one problem that existed in the production, it was always articulated that we were supposed to make a work or sketch a work that could be realized later. It was very clear that the realization later would not happen because Alicia wasn't there and she was the key figure in production. So that was a bit complicated because not everybody was working in that mode of producing a work in 2 weeks. But I think that's why one reason why the workshop the year after was 6 weeks or 7 weeks. So it was much young. They kept the idea of production, but they made the time of people being in San Sebastian much longer. But in terms of the terminology, it would be interesting to speak to Montadas and Santi again, who came up with that. I mean, urban inventions is a real Montadas term, but who came up with this kind of broadening. That's also a Santi idea, right? That everything has to kind of expand it in all directions. So probably that's why they wouldn't use exhibition really as a term. And I think there were, people developed quite different formats. A lot of them were in public space, also public institutions, but also I think Ricardo's work is very clear, also like not reading context, but asking for context, a contextualization to people, and yeah, I think there were very different interpretations of that question. And that was open. I think there was no ever in that, you know. One is good, two is the norm. One more question? Okay, then I'm going.
Vamos a dar paso a, después de
Well, after Ines's presentation, it'd be great if she speaks into the microphone. We're going to continue now with Corinne Disserens. And we've invited we've invited her to address a specific moment of the local context, and as we'll see, this is very close to what Ines has been talking about. And this is the Puente de Pasaje project that she created in Bilbao. And she's also going to be talking about another workshop that she curated that was organized by Corinne at Artedeco, and both of them 1 year after urban interventions in 1995. And Corinne was the curator at the Taipei Biennial of 2016, and between 2011 and 2016 she was the director of the Museum of Arts at Brussels, and she also worked in Stuttgart at the Académie Schloss Solitude from 1989 to 1993. Well, she was between 1996 and 2008 she directed the Musée de Marseille and the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Nantes, and she was was involved in the opening of the new Bolzano Museum. She organized international co-productions for MACBA in Barcelona, and she founded Carta Blanca, which is under the umbrella, so to speak, under which she organized Puente de Pasaje and Colisiones. And she's also curated retrospective exhibitions of seminal artists, biennials and thematic exhibitions, and she also directed numerous publications, researches and transdisciplinary symposia. And after studying art history at the University Panthéon-Sorbonne, Paris, she was a fellow at the Independent Study Program of the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City, and she holds a PhD in Aesthetics, Science and Technology of the Arts by the University of Paris 8. Thank you very much. Corinne.
Much for the invitation. It is a pleasure for me to be back in Bilbao. Okay, I'm going to be a little chaotic because I have to admit it has not been easy for me to. I have a defect. I never so much go back on what I do. And I work a lot on archives with artists, on archives of artists. I restore archives of artists, but I'm totally unable to deal with my own archives, which I think is totally normal. You know, it needs to have exterior eyes. So I don't know what I'm going to do with now. The other thing I want just to say before to start is it took me a long time to find the box where was written Puente, and then inside were mostly bills, handwritten notes, facts, which were not readable because everything is erased, and I never photocopy my faxes. At the time, we were mostly working by fax. And a VHS tape, which I will show a few extracts, but which is really of bad quality. And I'm sure I was saying I have somewhere a master of better quality, which once I found it, I will send here so that you can have it. And some analog diapositives, which also I will send you, and you can go through. I didn't do. I just want to say that I was born closer to the end of Second World War than to the fall of the Berlin Wall. I arrived in Spain to work for IVAM when IVAM was opening in Valencia. And I arrived in Valencia living what we used to call the Reaganamia. The economical time of Reagan, the cowboy Reagan, the president, and which we could see at the time in the United States the quite harsh change in the methodology of running museums, with a kind of a new methodology of neoliberal finances managing into museums. And then slowly arriving into, but in different way, I will not develop here, into European museums. I think it's important to have this context, at least for me, when I think of the 90s and what we were working on, and what we lived in the 80s with quite a radical change, also with public grants, with the closing of many systems of public grants in the United States, when it was a very elaborated public program in the 70s. So here it's a little the panorama I wanted to give. Also, another point was the question of the growing of bureaucracy in public institutions, and specifically in my field in museums. But not only in museum or in cultural institutions, but how also bureaucracy kind of started to affect what we call art research or art experimentation and research program, and how this bureaucracy and the financing of it were changing and modifying our way of thinking in terms of possibility. From this time, I was very taken and interested in analyzing this bureaucracy, and also the question of the nomenclature, of the wording out, of the invention in words in order to counteract bureaucracy and nomenclature. And it's from this time in the 90s, I always kept a very, very strong interest in those questions. It has not left me, and I'm still working on it. and I would hear many people work on that, but I want to underline the importance for me at one point of activist thinker Graeber, who wrote this wonderful book, The Utopia of Rules on Technology, Stupidity, and the Secret Joys of Bureaucracy. And I know it's a very known book, but if some people don't know in the room, I highly recommend it. It's full of humor, but very sharp analysis. Then I would also say that Puente de Pasaje, I would think of it today as a momentum, a particular momentum, like we have momentum, and also as an encounter and how an encounter modifies perceptions. And this encounter, maybe I would also like to think of it as an event, and how event, when it's a collective construction, also modifies the way you look at things. So I would like to think of it as a momentum, an event, and a way for us who we were working together, artists, architects, curators, citizens, how to try to modify our perceptions, our perspectives. So it didn't have any big program behind. It was really a moment of questioning this momentum. But before, and I get lost, so you have to time me. Huh? Before I go into briefly, more precisely, but briefly in Puente, I have to do a second contextualization, which is I could call my curatorial context of the time, because why we developed here this project came from another exhibition, which was called Time and Tide. It was going to be a biannual project in Newcastle upon Tyne. It was called the Tyne International, and it was organized by the Art Council of Great Britain. And so I curated the Time and Tide in 94, right? that I don't say stupid. Yeah, I think just the year before, 93, sorry. In 93, and I spent therefore a lot of time in north of England, in Scotland, in cities that were in transformation, in post-industrial transformation, in Liverpool, etc. But it happens also that Newcastle-upon-Tyne had a big river called Tyne with bridges, and was exactly like Bilbao at the time, was turning its back to the river. And it was extremely strong, this sentiment, like it was in Bilbao when I visited Bilbao, this turning back to the river, not being the river crossing the city, but being in this conflictual articulation, and therefore being in a tension with the wish development of a city, but not being really also simply accessible. Because the other things was not only symbolically and in the real construction of post-industrial time turning back to the river, but it was very difficult in many of its places to be on the river quayside. And it was in Newcastle and in Bilbao the same experience. So I will just quickly list what was in Time and Time, because you will see the link then with some of the articulation of Puente de Pasaje. We were also in Newcastle-upon-Tyne, which was also a similar, even different but similar question at a big moment for the Art Council of Great Britain and the city and the region, discussing what could be institutional development for modern and contemporary arts. So it was definitely this momentum of all those cities defining a program, architectonic program and cultural program of reassessing the function and the use and the construction of a city which is demoralized by the change in the post-industrial time, and at the same time which is developing to redynamize but repositive the physical reality of those industrial cities. So that was exactly the situation in Newcastle. Just for the little memory, the Baltic, which now is quite known, it's a quite large contemporary art center in the English landscape, was not existing. Time and time we took a warehouse on the quayside which was abandoned, and we worked with an architect, Tony Fretton, to first reassess the ground floor of this warehouse as a first hospitable place when there was absolutely almost nothing all along the quayside and abandoned buildings. So what could be thought as architectonic structuration, working with Tony Fretton, the architecture, and also was a space for projection where two programs were organized, one by myself and the other by the filmmaker Raúl Ruiz, the Chilean filmmaker who was living in Paris. And on the other floor, different artists worked, and also the agency Ready-Mades Belong to Everyone installed itself, his office, his storage in the warehouse. Then the exhibition took place in many different buildings nearby the quayside up to the station. building which were from 12th century to 19th century with quite important symbolic marking of development of the city, with the School of Velocity of Rodney Graham, Vito Acconci on the side, Tunga in one of the bridge tower. Anyway, I'm not going here to list everything, but there was a sense that of capture, of activation, of possible relation to this area around this polluted river. As you can see, describing this Newcastle, I could even remove Newcastle and put Bilbao and see how we would work the same way in 93, 94, 95 in those cities. I just want to read a little text of, if it's here, of Raúl Ruiz, because for the program, okay, because for me it was interesting to reread this text 27 years after. I'm very sorry for the translator. I could have photo it and give it to her. Between two exiles. De las cuatro pa delante, linda palomitai, no hay cantina.
After 4, no bag will be open. I am a foreigner. Tomorrow I'm leaving. I am a shepherd and I go with my dreams. From the 2, more the desert. Loneliness is not scary to me. The loneliness that I wear is the loneliness of the soul.
Years ago, I quote now Raúl Ruiz, years ago a film came to me. The image concealed a risk, the colorful and exasperating presentation of a double-edged metaphor. Its theme could be summed up as every exile is a voyage and every voyage is an exile. The idea was sparked by the many stories that mask the dead in life and the life in death of a sailor whose tempestuous existence beyond the grave gradually reveals, amidst digressions and lamentations, a melancholy allegory of exile. A sailor travels the world and in remote lands meets men and women who, only through his own choice, will constitute his family. Without knowing it, I was foreboding to myself the imminency of a second exile. To begin with, exile meant no more than being away from the native home. Afterwards, the native home would shatter and its fragments would have to be sought throughout the world. This is not very different from the metaphor of the broken vessel of the Hasidic Jews. I thought I had reached the very limits of exile, if that proposition makes sense. I was wrong. I still had to go through that very last stage. At least that was my hope. For many years now, I have been overcome by the urge to continue every book I read in another and then another, so as if to remain for a long time the company of a single character, a single plot, a single author was an unnatural act. Not long ago, I realized that every film I saw reminded me of a different one. Yet, the links between them were almost never obvious. I said to myself, it is only natural that one plot should remind you of a similar one, or that this actor makes you think of another film in which he has taken part. But what could be the connection between Pueblerina, a Mexican film by Emilio Fernandez, and The Best Years of Our Lives by William Wheeler? Or between 2001 by Kubrick and Black Rain by Imamura? Gradually, I became aware that a new kind of exile was forming in me. It was not exile from the mother country, nor from mankind, but exile from human works. If a film made me think of another, not just anyone, but one in particular, it was because what I was looking for between them was the abyss that placed them farther apart. That abyss was the land of exile, the terra incognito, into which I and many like me were entering. The films that we are bringing out today try to reproduce the feeling of exile. Let us call it exile of the third degree, that I have tried clumsily to convey. In some cases, I'm thinking of Stromboli paired with the exterminating angel. Both the links, the rifts between films are almost obvious. Exile and confinement, the social game as enigma, as unforgiven weapon. In other cases, the link is obscure even to me. It is enough to know that always, in every pair of films proposed, the same anguish, the same disturbing strangeness, the same feelings of horror and liberation are present. So this text in one way respond to so many things we work in the exhibition with the artist, but I will stop here on Newcastle. I think I gave enough of this context just to say that the Baltic Center opened, I think, in 2002. I may be wrong of 1 year. But it started already in the mid-90s to be discussed. And the discussion was either to use one of these warehouses along the quayside or the, how do you call it, the mill, the huge mill that was abandoned in front on the other quayside. That's where then the Baltic Contemporary Art Institution opened many years after. So we were in discussion of all these questions, you know, which kind of institution we want, how do we deal with institutionalization and research and experimentation in arts, what about public and private funding, financing, and the managing methodology coming very strongly in institution. So, I have to up. So then, sorry, I'm just looking to my note. Okay. So I was living in Madrid after I left 4 years working at IVAM in Valencia. And it seemed necessary for a few of us to have a tool which would not be anchored in an institution. So we founded this cultural association, Carta Blanca, which was registered in Madrid. And like with a normal association, with a president, treasury, etc. But we were also very much dialoguing with Art Teleco, and I will come now to Art Teleco, who invited me and the artist Francisco Mila to organize in 1995, so the year after the workshop we just heard about, a workshop which we call Colisiones, which lasted almost 7 weeks, but in fact lasted more. Because many of the artists involved in the workshop decided to prolongate their stay to continue and their work. So there is a catalog, so you can, anyone who is interested, the catalog is definitely available in any place. in Bibliothèque. And I just want maybe to present who were part of the workshop and then speak of a building, the Mercado de Gros, I think was called, yeah, Marché en Gros, who was slowly being abandoned by the users, the people who sold their vegetable, fish, etc., as it was decided to demolish this very special place in San Sebastian. And for a few of the artists, it became a kind of a place of action towards this demolition. But we will go back to that. So let me just quickly tell you. So we made a call, an open call, and from this open call, a group of artists came. Iki Nakagawa, Claire Collin, Taketo Chimada, Lara Almarsegui, Elke Lehmann, Brian Dick, Richard Reynolds, Olivier Bardin, Tony Crabb, Vicente Esquerdo, Gerard Byrne, Judith Weig, Stephen Clayton Hellwood, Amanda Schachter, and Daniel Knorr. And the guests who came to visit the workshop to intervene with the young artists in residency participating were Catherine David, Guillermo Gomez Peña, Gary Hill, Dominique Bartassa, Peter Frenz, Ulrich Obris, Carol and Clona Hadis. And the project ended up with intervention in the city. I will not here present, it would be much too long, of all the participants to the different project. I would maybe just read a little tiny sentence of the project of Lara Almarsegui, who decided to paint and repaint in white the market, who was going to be demolished, were left only a few users and sellers in it. And Elke Lehmann, which had done a very beautiful attachment to the market, she called it Las Alas Postscript, where she took the venture of shops and displaced them at the bottom of the market and painted them also in white. And so Lara's piece was called Pintar para Derribar, and in the catalogue she published only one thing. Se extraña Rogelio Malher, quote, me llama la atención que este.
I'm shocked by the fate that the facade of the gross market is being painted since it's going to be demolished. What money are they going to use to pay for that, and why? In September 1995, it was published by the Diario Vasco, the newspaper.
Yes, but just to say that we organized Colisiones at the same time, and we were developing Puente de Pasaje in Bilbao. Sorry, I'm reading sometimes my little note to focus. Okay, so the idea of Puente de Pasaje, the proposal was to, on one hand, invite artists to intervene in a zone which was linked symbolically to the Puente Colgante. You all know, I don't need to do the history of this remarkable bridge. Is it still in use 24 hours every day? Yeah. That was something we were very attentive. The fact that it was working 24 hours. It's not? I'm asking, I don't know, I haven't been there. Okay, so the transportador was working 24 hours all the time. And also what for us was interesting was that it was linked in two different barrios, quartiers. One came directly from working class and the history of industrial work configuration, and the other side more from the history of a certain bourgeoisie linked to industrial wealth and colonial constituencies, but also evidently the fact that there was a lot of historical link in the industrial wealth construction in El País Vasco, in Bilbao, with England. So in one way we were continuing with some of the English artists, architects, we had work, a dialogue in Bilbao in relation to this configuration, which has a lot of similarity. The project Puente de Pasaje was organized by Carta Blanca with the Institut Français in Bilbao and with many in-kind services from different partners here in Bilbao. So we invited artists to come, to spend time, to think of intervention in this area of Portugalete, Getxo, but not only. Romain Signer, who came, decided to do an intervention in Consoni building. It was just at the moment of the closing. It's by memory I'm saying that, so if you think I say wrong things, please don't hesitate to correct me. It was the moment where Consoni was displacing their activities to a new modern building outside of the, it was not an island because we could go, the Presqu'île. And so, but it was, Consoni building was still handled by the people of the company. So we negotiate with them to have the access to the building for this performance of Romain Signer. Romain Signer, and we discuss a lot with certain of the people working in the company. Who were involved in one way in our organization. And Romain Signer did 4 performances in the building on each floor, and I will show you a tiny extract of very bad quality. I know for your archive, Romain Signer did film it very well and made the editing. I just had no time to contact Romain Signer in Switzerland, but if for the archive you are interested, he did a good documentary film on that. And so Consoni, as you know better than me, this gesture, this intervention in the building, then was transformed in one way, was prolongated by the 2 years, I think. I was not back then, so for 2 years the Consoni building was used as a place for art projects and various activity, which was co-organized by Franck Larcade, which was the coordinator of Puente de Pasaje. So then there was, maybe I show you a few fragments of this bad video. Some parts are glue, so, but I got some part. But just to, well, I'm okay. Just to, before to show you some of the pieces and maybe just describe it briefly, I want to give a little more into the context of the time. And it was already said by Ines, you know, the question, the anguish, I would say, that the coming up of this museum Guggenheim, but not only, also the question of franchise. I think, you know, the franchise, the exportation, the cultural colonialism of a very large North American institution into a city like Bilbao. That was a very important question. But also the fact that the Guggenheim had also tried to open museum in other cities, and maybe we forgot a little all that, and it was not always very welcome. And there was also in some cities also much later, like in Helsinki, where the Guggenheim was going to open, and there was a major movement by the citizens of Helsinki to refuse and to cancel the project, which had been already quite advanced in the articulation. So Bilbao was not only a place, there was ongoing, and I think that's also what you mentioned in Hansake stories. It was not an isolated case. It was a very ongoing, present question of this of museum and franchise exportation, and also which brought how do you conceive content in such a frame. And is it possible to have a meaningful marking program which is specific and international, but also specific to the condition where a museum is being opened with this kind of configuration? So they were very present at the time. But also, evidently, the rearticulation of a post-industrial city and how to make the river, again, an axe of leisure, in a city. The term leisure at the time was very present, you know, culture, leisure, services, transformation of an organization of a city towards that. So I am not going to read everything, I'm just going to read two fragments. One of an article in El País, dated of 2nd of November 1994. Bilbao mira por fin a la ría. Revitalizar el área metropolitana, excuse me, my accent, but de la capital.
Of the capital of Vizcaya, which has to do with decongestion and specialization. Aitor Aguinaga.
Bilbao ha vivido.
Bilbao has ignored the river for too long, and it's also been under lots of democratic pressure. 44% of the Basque population lives around or near the capital of Vizcaya. The crisis of the industrial of the industry, of the shipyards, of the steel mills, has taken away the protagonism of the capital, and the projects for Bilbao, so that it can recover its key role, intend to implement a new urban model that will respond to the reconversion of its production apparatus. And town planners believe that it can only be decongestion and industrial specialization that can put a stop to that deteriorated leadership.
Limpiar la ría.
But cleaning up the river. Betty Duñareitia is addressing the dream that many citizens of Bilbao have. He was the president of Athletic Club de Bilbao, and he was the mayor for a few months. In 1996, I dived into the river from the San Anton Bridge. I had an ace up my sleeve, which was the sanitation plan. residual or wastewaters are already being processed. The wastewater produced by 275,000 inhabitants that account for 75% of the contamination. In 1997, the plan eliminated 70% of the contamination of 674,000 citizens for a very low price, which was 52 billion at that point in time. And the crisis was hitting Bilbao. It impoverished Bilbao, but it made it possible to deliver a new city model. The sites vacated by the shipyards and several places vacated by Alto Soros de Vizcaya, things that were represented the splendor of the past, were emptied. And most of these, it's 1.5 million square meters in the industrial ruins.
I think important sometimes to immerse ourselves in, you know, what was the mental frame and perspective that was mirror in this Bilbao. El país estamos en 19 de diciembre.
Well, this is December the 19th of 1995, so that was more than 1 year later, and Bilbao again. They asked Bertolt Brecht why had he used the title Bilbao Song when this city had no relevance in the dramatic approach of that theatre piece that was designed in cooperation with Kochberg, I think she said. Brecht had seen the name on a map somewhere, and he liked the way the letters looked. He said it aloud, and he even liked it more. And the sound of that place that he knew nothing about, he wanted to make it become familiar, or to meet up with the music of his verses. Bilbao sounds very nice indeed, but it has something else too. Bilbao, Bigas Lunas titled one of his first films Bilbao, and the film had nothing to do with the environment in Vizcaya, but the protagonist that became an obsession, the prostitute that became an obsession for the protagonist, was called Bilbao. Bilbao is an ugly city, an industrial city, two adjectives that seem to be together in a symbiosis, and the same applies to Glasgow and Chicago and Oporto. They are supposed to be very dark and very contaminated in favor of progress. And this is why these are cities that make us look at the concept of what is beauty from a completely different angle. And Bilbao can attract things that are much less tetric, and the skeleton of the Guggenheim Museum is representative of the creature that Gehry is going to be creating there, but the new metro of Norman Foster is a completely living body, which is there for the comfort of the traveller and to remind people about the expressionist melancholia that people have. And there are the stations are beautiful with those aluminium entrances that people can use from the streets. And Gehry is building one of his masterworks. Bilbao will have its own lay secular cathedral of the 21st century, and will set aside that dark city of the past. But you can also go to Santiago de Compostela and also to Girona, to Seville and Valencia. where there's a modern approach where the socialists wanted to have foster Thessalpeli Calatrava, or they wanted to have a multi-purpose music center or theater, or a square open to different kind of interpretations, like in the films by Antonioni. So if the Europe of the cities was a utopia, it's now reached Spain. And I'm very glad, because this coincides with the disappearance of the dream of the super capital that was Madrid. Social psychology is not very strong, but I'm sure that there are dark links between the fifth political essence of Madrid, which is the head of the state and the head of the government, and its current aesthetic and urban and moral decadence. Well, how is it that Madrid has, well, talking about recent public goods, how come they have the most dissonant auditorium of Spain and the poorest museum of contemporary art and the candy-looking communications tower? How can it have the cardboard-looking statues and the most ridiculous theatres? And I'm getting to the end now. So perhaps one would say that this symbolic degradation has to do with the current bias we can find in whatever is public, that has been brought about by progressive powers that are now withdrawing. And this has produced an immobile, introvert and grandiloquent monster. So these are things that practically have no influence whatsoever. But we will always have the renovated provincial capitals, like, for instance, Bilbao, where you have a clear example of this.
This situation in this. So I'm going to show you a few pieces, and during the project Puente, we also organized a seminar in October 1995, where was invited different person. Here is the person who gave a formal intervention, but then the seminar kind of continue with less formal intervention, and I will just here list what was formally published for the 2 days, but then it continued for a few more days. Christine Breton, which was Conservadora del Patrimonio in Ciudad de Marsella, because we invited Christine Breton and Montadas, who were both working on certain projects in the city of Marseille at the time, and which were crossing a lot of questions that were discussed in Bilbao at the time. Vito Acconci, which he wrote a special lecture, and I don't know if you have already, if you had heard Vito Acconci. I really liked his lecture, I have to say, because he had a very specific way of speaking. He would mix a description, a very precise description of pieces, of context in a city where he was working, mixed with his more poetic writing. And you will switch constantly from urban description to his poetic writing. He wrote many poetry and also script many pieces for the radio and for sound pieces. So public space in a private time. So that's a text we were going to publish with some other in a catalog that never came out. So I now found all these texts in the box. Brian Hatton, who was, as I was, because I think he's retired, professor at the AA, the Architecture Association in London, and at the Moore University of Liverpool, who was very much working on this configuration of transformation of North England cities in post-industrial time. Montadas already mentioned it with his Marseille project. We invited Elias Masserra, who was the architect, and you know him, who was working on this regeneration of Bilbao. Guadalupe Echevarria, which at the time was the director of the Bordeaux Escuela de Bellas Artes, and was born in Bilbao and had many things to share of her perspective at the time of Bilbao. There was Robert Harbison, who is a writer, was at the time a professor at the University of North London and also at the AA, at the Architecture Association, who was mostly working with his student and with the lab on the notion of industrial ruin, but the notion of ruin as a question. How do we deal with this extremely loaded configuration historically, narratively, and architectonically of the ruin. And then Marcello Exposito, who had, and now I will come to the timing of the show, who premiered during the seminar his film video, Octubre en el Norte Temporal del Noroeste, that he produced in the frame of Puente de Pasaje. Now I think the video is part of the collection of Magba, but he also reworked on the film for another configuration. Then years after, in 2003 or 4, I don't remember, he presented as a triptych, as one part of a triptych on different perspective of what he had been working on the 25 years. So he also intervened and spoke of his work that he did. So that brings me to one aspect of Puente de Pasaje, which it was, we call it an exhibition, and with intervention in the city, which lasted almost 1 year. So we had work, each works which artists could define the time they needed, they wanted. So for example, as I already mentioned, Roman Signer would, his piece would last a few minutes. I mean, 4 times, few seconds, a few minutes in the Consoni building. Denis Adams' piece in the public swimming pool lasted a few months, for example. Marcello, his projection was the time of the film, but he considers that the time of his piece, and it was the way he was presenting it at the time, was his research time, and he had stayed almost 1 year working on this film in Bilbao, and other artists were different timing. And so the idea was not to have, we were not a museum, we had no need to be accountable of our visitors, of our, of all what include to be inside an institution. So we could freely expand, stretch and squeeze, in different timing, following the necessity, following our finances. We were working on very small budgets, following the capacity of our partner to give us in-kind support, which went from everything. We were lodged in a hotel as an in-kind service. I mean, so many things was in a collaboration with different partners, but that also mean we were dependent of many things. And in place of trying to fight this condition of delicate and not secure budget and work, we decided to be quite organic in the way the project would develop, and sometimes chaotic and with failure and with non-success too of produce. On all the work we organize and produce, one work was not realized. One of all the work was the work of Suzanne Lafont, and I will just show you a few images because it's expanded geographically what the project was also working. So up, where are you? Here. What do I have to do? I'm sorry, it's not my computer. Why it doesn't want to open? Ah, here. Up. Maybe it's very slow. What I'm doing wrong? Ah, okay. Yeah, okay. So that was the project of Suzanne Lafont, a very beautiful project which needed quite extensive work on it. Which you all recognize for the people from Bilbao, the train station, right? From Bilbao La Narra to Santurtzi. So at the middle of the line, you have the station Desertu, desert. So she organized the proposition of affichage. Affichage in English? Huh? Yeah, of exposing like very large poster in every station. In each station was in relation to the contrary station of the other side. So until Desertu, which means what you would see would relate to the future until the station of Desertu. And from Desertu, she would show image that related to past station, which means until Desertu, you would be confronted to something which speaks of your future, of your travel, and from Desertu, something which has to do with what you just experiment in passing the other station. I'm going to read in French, but our translator has the text in French. Text Suzanne wrote that would have been also in this ghost catalog, and because it's very beautiful. It's okay? So, yeah, I have a few minutes. Désert to be, Suzanne Lafont. Le livre, le mot, les yeux, de l'œil au cerveau mauvais. Le livre, le mot, les yeux, se déplaçant d'un côté à l'autre, déjà mieux. Qui n'a pas potassé marchant d'un bout à l'autre d'un espace entouré de 4 murs, livre en main? Qui n'a pas tambouriné rythmiquement de son poing tandis qu'il imposait à sa mémoire la valeur excédentaire est? C'est-à-dire qui n'a pas aidé sa stimulation optique au moyen de quelques rythmes mécaniques tandis qu'il fixait une abstraction dans sa mémoire. Ça, c'est de Eisenstein, c'est une quote d'Eisenstein dans Perspective, dans ma conception du cinéma. Et là commence le texte écrit par Suzanne. Nous avons pris le train à une heure tardive de la journée où la lumière ne permettait plus de discerner le contour des objets. L'abandon de nombreux sites industriels le long du trajet donnait aux vastes constructions livrées à elles-mêmes une vacuité identitaire qui semblait les vouer à l'imaginaire. De plus, le train, dans son mouvement, paraissait animer les grands éléments de la vue dans un motif mouvant, né de la combinaison des formes et de leur assimilation. Par la fenêtre, le paysage s'offrait au regard sous un angle où toutes les associations imaginaires devenaient possibles. Un autre monde s'ouvrait à côté du monde. D'un côté, les gares, arpentant et balisant l'espace, de l'autre, les trains, faisant surgir les simulacres. Le réel et l'imaginaire, les gares et le train, l'immobilité et le mouvement, les gares en avance ou en retard sur les trains, mais toujours noués ensemble. Les trains sont des lieux privilégiés d'effectuation de l'imaginaire. Les trains de banlieue surtout. Véhicules de transport, non d'évasion, ils isolent une période de flânerie mentale entre le temps compté du travail et le temps compté au foyer. À travers la vitre, il lie le déracinement optique du passager à son inactivité pour offrir à la fantaisie de son esprit un écran où vagabonder. Les trains fixent l'itinéraire au récit. Le voyageur empruntant la ligne Bilbao-La Narra-Santurtzi s'apercevra que chaque gare de cet itinéraire abrite un affichage systématique et répétitif, à l'exception de l'une d'entre elles, Desertu-Baracaldo. À l'intérieur de chaque station, les affiches associent l'image d'un marcheur, personnage solitaire à la marche à la fois grave et grotesque, à l'image d'un lieu situé non loin de la gare. Les étapes sont nommées, l'arpentage identifié, et ce piéton fantaisiste semble suivre scrupuleusement la ligne de chemin de fer. Toutefois, sa direction est inverse à celle du passager assis dans le train. L'usager de la ligne monte à Bilbao-La Narra quand le piéton imaginaire part de Santurtzi. À la deuxième gare, le voyageur réel apercevra donc le piéton déambuler à proximité de l'avant-dernière gare. À la troisième, il le retrouvera au voisinage de l'antépénultième, ainsi de suite jusqu'à la superposition partielle ou complète des deux parcours inversés selon la portion de ligne parcourue. La projection de la ligne de chemin de fer sur l'ordre conventionnel du parcours induit une régression du futur, dans un premier temps vers le présent, le point de coïncidence du présent avec lui-même se situant au centre de la ligne, à la station de Desertu-Baracaldo. Dans un deuxième temps, vers le passé le plus lointain, correspondant dans la réalité de perception au terme du voyage. Pendant qu'il réalise effectivement son parcours, le voyageur fait également une expérience de ce parcours comme imaginaire, puisqu'à l'image actuelle des gares viennent se superposer successivement et systématiquement les images de la part future et passée du voyage, pour un passager idéal parcourant la ligne en totalité. Desertu-Baracaldo est donc le lieu où le voyage comme activité mentale se confond avec l'expérience du monde. C'est la région lisse et sans écho où l'imaginaire s'effondre dans l'image de la réalité, la rêverie des lieux sur les murs résolument présents et vides de la gare. La cadence mécanique du piéton dans l'immobilité et le désœuvrement du passager assis dans le train. Desertu, terme de l'imaginaire, entrée et sortie du manège, bordure du miroir, retour à l'ordre du monde. Mais l'insistance du monde ici à la qualité fixe de ce qui traverse le temps, Desertu, lieu archive, non archive. D'abord passerelle géographique, ce point ferroviaire est un lieu de correspondance et assure la communication entre la région minière et la vallée où est implanté le complexe sidérurgique. Il relie l'une à l'autre les étapes de la production industrielle. Ce lieu nous parle historiquement de la géographie et rassemble abstraitement la logique du procès industriel. De plus, il condense un imaginaire paysager entre les couches profondes du terrain que les industries ont longuement exploité et la déstructuration du tissu industriel observé aujourd'hui, le nom Desertu que la langue vernaculaire basque emprunte directement à la langue savante du latin desertus, sauvage, abandonné, intercale les images d'une terre archaïque vierge de toute humanité et du paysage agraire primitif avec ses champs partiellement laissés à l'abandon. Pour finir, ce nom enveloppe la vue des usines décomposées dans un écho général d'effondrement. Ici, la rêverie spéculative de l'itinéraire, liée à l'horizontalité de la traversée du paysage, permet d'isoler et de nommer un lieu. Elle appelle, de ce fait, à se fixer en ce lieu et sur son nom les figures verticales de l'imaginaire historique. Ce travail tente de localiser un point où l'ordre concret de la géographie nous parle plus de l'abstraction de la pensée que de son immersion dans le monde de la nature. Yeah. So I just show you what was the project. Can I take 3 minutes? Yeah? And now to finish, if I can close this. Sorry, I'm not used to the up. Oh, it's extremely slow. Okay. Why it doesn't want to close? Can you just put that on? So as I say, it's very bad image, and I will go through like a vampire, because we don't have time, and some are so bad that. But how can I? Oh, I'm sorry. Can someone who knows better this computer help me? It seems I'm not doing the right things. If I want to...
Yeah.
I have to go. Okay. That's the project of Hans-Peter Kuhn, who was fluorescent light and 40 fluorescent light and 18 or 16 speakers, which were randomly, can we put, okay, which we missed this sound, so I will go, sorry, up, which were, we will find it after. I'm sorry, I cannot act. I found it just at the middle. Which was randomly with the transborder moving, proposing different music, which was not only heard from the bridge, but from all the area of the bridge, and were kind of melting with the sound of the area. Then Roman Signer, maybe, I don't know if I can show it's not good quality, but I'm so bad with this. Okay, up. I'm going to pass. Okay, that's the piece. I just show 30 seconds. So the suspended is arriving and provoking different sound configuration, including some recording of the environment. Anyway, I'm not going, I was just giving you an idea. I will find the master and send it to you. And then I want to show you, okay, that's Wendy Kirkup, Wendy Kirkup and Pavnaldi, who are artists from Newcastle, who in fact worked, they work with films and videos. They recorded different passages of trains of these lines in Bilbao and of train along the Tyne in Newcastle, and mixed this editing, going from a very descriptive image, sometimes stopping with people in station, to an extremely abstract materiality of the filmic image. And those were shown in monitors in the different stations of the train. Okay, up. I'm not going to, well, okay, here you have a Roman Signer, different action. One action was a screen downstairs when he was upstairs, spraying paint on the ceilings upstairs of Consoni. Let me just another piece lasted a few seconds, was just people going up to a floor of Consoni and being hidden under this black blanket until it will just happen now. So it was just this few seconds, and then he moved to another room. I cannot believe. Then doing another performance with paint and in a floor, and then finish with this piece also, which lasted only a few seconds, which we are going to see. And another piece with inundation, anyway. And then I just want to finish on two things, and I'm done. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm so unable. Yeah, that was the boat that collective organized on the quayside, which was La Isla de los Copyright, which was a time of collaborating with approximately 80 artistic collective artists from all around the world, and this boat was installed on the quayside, and questioning in different ways, from text, from image, from works of art, from laws, from legal text, from different perspectives, the notion of copyright. And I will, anyway, I'm going to stop here, and I will to end with tiny what I just received on the phone from from Santo Eraso text of Catherine sent it to me. His text, which is in the catalogue of the exhibition of Miguel Benlor, because Miguel Benlor, who died some months ago, had made a very special performance in the glass boat organized by this collective. In this collective, Federico Guzman was one of the members and stayed all the time in this place to activate the boat. And I quote Santi, en 1995 volvimos a...
In 1995, we met again in Bilbao. There we did Transito as part of this Copyright Island exhibition of the Gratis collective group. And so on and so forth. That very same year, blah, blah, blah. These were the days when in a naive way we thought that thanks to the new digital technologies that were at the time only photocopy machines and primitive computers, we would be able to change the old paradigm of copyright and the reproductivity and use new ways, more legitimate, that we restore the use of common goods and arts. We were really naive.
Bertie from Londonderry, where he introduced work in cafes near the area, videos, which was a still moment of people going to work using the Puente Colgante, and the shooting of a bridge in Londonderry, Londonderry being his place where he was born, but being a very conflictual religion, nationalistic question land, right? And incorporating this very strange image of a person running in this bridge in Londonderry, which he intercepts in a very strange way with the image of the everyday of the people transmuting through these two parts of the Nervion River. Anyway, there is other project, but I have passed my time and I'm very sorry, I apologize.
Hola, como vamos igual un poquito tarde, si alguien tiene algún...
Well, since we're running a bit late, should you have any questions? Do you have any questions? Otherwise, we move on to the next intervention.
¿Cuál es el espacio central? Porque igual este es el espacio central. Pues Leire y yo nos podemos colocar. Nosotras nos ponemos aquí y tú te pones ahí. Vale. Sí. Bueno, hemos llegado al tercer momento, la tercera invitada de...
So we move on to the third speaker. And we're going to have a conversation with Katrina David. She's the curator of Documenta 10 that took place in Kassel in August 1995. I think she needs no introduction. I'm just briefly going to mention that she is the deputy director of the Musée National d'Art Moderne, le Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris. And since 2014, she's been the head of the Research and Globalization Department. She was also curator at this very same museum. And also from 90 to 94, she was also the head at the Galerie Nationale de Jeux de Paume in Paris. And then she also was the artistic director for Documenta 10. And she's also the director of a long-term project, Contemporary Arab Representations. And in between 2002 and 2004, she was the director of the WIT Center of Contemporary Art in Rotterdam. And we could further mention all the things she's been doing in her career, but I think we're going to rather move on to our dialogue. So I'm going to make some questions and then let Catherine sort of, share with us the last very complex and sophisticated project that she embarked on. And we didn't attend Documenta 10, but we have information from this event. We had some papers, and the first papers we found about an interview that you had with Miriam Eraso, and I think it was published in 1995, and I think this is when you visited Art Teleco. And I don't know whether this was part of these encounters of colisiones organized by Corinne. At the time, Miriam asks you about Documenta, about your projects. I would like to sort of know, what do you remember of that specific visit? Well, I am a bit like Ines. This was a long time ago. And what I do remember is that this is one of the first visits I paid to Art Teleco, and I came more often, and I did come to the different projects. And what I do remember perfectly well is Miriam. She was really friendly, very tranquil, very quiet, but she really paid attention to our projects, and she was highly instrumental for the development of all these project. And of course, I do not remember what we talked about at the time, but this is part of a certain dynamic that happened at the time. I didn't want these to be like fireworks, just like to say, well, nothing is going on and suddenly fireworks. We opened Documenta. I really wanted it to be a process with different stages and with different audiences and viewers at different moments in time. And so part of this dynamics was registered and published in that early documents, the Documenta documents that would document the process and different talks that will then turn into the projects of the document, and also some things that were sort of abandoned because they were meaningless, because sometimes do not end up seeing the light. And I think the talk with Miriam was part of this. What would be the starting point in order to relate it to previous editions? I think the previous one was so much the opposite to what really concerned me or to my interest. So I was invited after a certain selection process. And I told them, if you expect from me to do the same thing, I mean, I think you are choosing the wrong person. I just go home, because I don't have the intention to do anything at all like that. So then I explained to them what I thought would be interesting and possible to do at the time. It was very particular, because in 1997, that was right after the Berlin Wall fell, and we were like on the edges, on the borders of the East. And we were rather in a central space, and it was a moment in time when the notion of international turned into rather a notion of something global. International meant global at the time. I thought that this should be part of Documentum, but this was not my decision. It was the last Documentum of the century, so we decided to celebrate artists that were 20 during the first Documenta in 1957. We wanted to sort of say, well, there was a generation that I really liked. They were experimental, radical artists in many senses, and they had an idea of the aesthetic practices. That was a high one. They were not part of this economy of leisure or entertainment. This is something that already started in the 80s. So we were in a moment when more and more the invasion of the space of thinking, of the experimental space, was being invaded by different maneuvers. I don't know how to say. You know, all these things that were more about entertainment. And I rather wanted to sort of go back to our origins and foster aesthetic practices articulated with a good balance in between intellect and formal production. And I don't know how to put it, to again look different at those seminal artists and do a retro perspective, not to look into the past, because it always seems like better, but rather to look into a recent past, because 50 years is not that long ago, to better understand our future, how we could transform things, what should we neglect or leave aside. It was the last Documento of the century, but that was not my decision, Catherine says. And it was the last one to be managed or directed by a woman. Well, the first, sorry. Well, I thought it was an insult, really, to say this to me. And I said, well, here I am. I'm not going to change my gender or my sex, because this is the way Documenta is, whether you like it or not. And I think I was brought up in a family with only daughters. So there was never this issue about boys do this and girls do something else. We were all brought up like everything is possible if you really work, if you make an effort. My father used to say, if you don't study, if you don't work, then you would also have the choice to work in a factory. But apart from that, I thought in 1997 to listen to this kind of silly comments, I thought it was like an insult, really. So from this point of view, you didn't take that into account. Well, one can see things in many different ways. And I do see these structural issues, the inequalities in the structures. and in certain cultural establishments. But that is my philosophy. I believe in the power of the individual. I don't think you are a victim of anything. I think we have to give up on that kind of thinking. And I think we should sort of forget about that as much as possible. Then, of course, there are different ways to sort of use your authority, and they are very different. And that depends on your sex, your education, your gender. But I think you have to do it your way, and that's it. That's about it. Of course, every time one has a certain degree of authority, and authority means doesn't mean at all a lot sort of cravings or anything alike. And not everybody likes it. But I like to go back to our source of information in order to prepare this talk. And so that is going back to the catalog. That is what is left for those that didn't attend the documentary. So one can sort of have a look at the exhibition and then the catalog. And something that is very specific to this catalog is that it alludes or it avoids being just a compilation of essays. And it is rather balanced in between images and documents. And it is articulated around 4 dates with this idea of this retrospective, like going back to the first post-war, all through the year 97. So what was the impact on the exhibition of all this? Well, first of all, you said that is what you have left many years later of such a huge exhibition. Okay, here, even though this might seem like something of a different century, and it was a different century, we then used to have internet to work. We would send faxes to each other, and Frances would send me a nighttime crazy fax. I was sleeping, and I would hear the fax coming in, and we would work using our telephones. So, I mean, there were some rights, and there was a very different way to work. And of course, I lost many of these things because I only had slides. And I think the book sort of collects the material that is really more fair in order to keep the memory of this event. It is a book, I insist. It is not a catalog. From the very beginning, I said I wanted rather to have a book. I didn't want to stress artists to finish the works before a given date, so we could take a picture of that beautiful piece of art in our catalog. And I think also because at the time, I was working at the beginning of the 80s already, and some of the artist production you don't really have. I mean, it doesn't make sense to have their work of, I don't know, 97, but then not having the one of the year 2000. And sometimes we consider this as a fetish, and also sometimes leads to wrong thinkings. Sometimes you start sort of getting deep into some of the works, and somehow you realize they're like a repetition. So from the very beginning, I tried to organize the whole of the production of Documenta and the methodology with 3 teams. One was the one working for the exhibition, and I wanted to organize an exhibition with 3 satellites, and they said, no, you have a contract to have a Documenta in Kassel, and that's it. So I gave up. But I didn't want to sort of give up on my Iranian friend, so I invented this project that was about like 100 and something days. So it's always 100 days, the document. So I had this team for the book, another team for the repositioning, and then for Documenta itself. And there it is clear that the book in its structure should follow our way of thinking, of conceiving the exhibition.
We had a book production structure from the very beginning, and not in the last 3 or 6 months with everybody in a hurry to get things done. And I really believe that the idea was to condense process and to carry out an articulation. And it was Poetics Politics, that was the title that was taken from a work by Marcel Brotas. And this also allowed us to strike a balance, at least that's what I believe from my point of view, because we need to strike a balance between thought, articulation, and the execution. It's not the poetry, it's the politics behind the works. So we started to work and to accumulate material, and we started to set aside certain things and to focus on others. And all the artists were invited to produce a number of pages that didn't have to contain the image of the work that was being presented, but rather had to do with the two-dimensional space of the book, and give an idea of a project that would end up in the 3 dimensions of the exhibition space, and that worked pretty well. There was one that I can't remember now when that didn't happen, and I thought that we would have more problems, but it worked pretty well. Well, yes, this was also covered in the publication too, wasn't it? Well, it lasted long. It took longer because you had to identify people, and then you had to set up the program and write the script. But at the end, we had a completely accurate program, a very precise program. So many people, not only a few, decided to coincide with the day when the presentation took place. Yes, and through the book, we come to the notion of montage. And a technique was addressed in the book in carrying out a montage, in other words, a montage involving the photographic documentation to present the political and historic episodes. So this was a concept that was introduced as the driving force behind the book itself. But this notion is not only doesn't only have to do with a montage involving images and texts or the erection of the exhibition itself, but this also has to do with the cinema technique. And it's true that cinema was one of the most important adaptations of the exhibition, but the catalogue did not include any images on the installation. But I would like to know how cinema worked, how it worked out from a conceptual perspective and also from a spatial perspective. Well, but before talking about the montage of the book or the montage of the exhibition, and this was done in a very accurate manner from the very beginning, and we could involve some artists at the very last minute, because I saw where we had some things that could be done and other things that could not be done. But this has to do with what you said before. You said that there were more texts on philosophy. There was no art critic either, or critique rather. But this was a bit of a disappointment, and we decided to go back to that point in time, which was not identified until only recently. So it was as from the late 50s when many artists started to work with materials that were absolutely heterogeneous, materials from town planning, from urbanism, or medical things, biological things, or whatever. And I think that that was a very important moment too. In the first, I prefer to use the term event instead of performances. I think that it's much more generous and much more open. And we involved some very relevant actors from the late 50s, and they started to document things in a very accurate manner. And we believe that it was important because Brotas, I think she said, is very resilient artist, very cultivated artist too. Although sometimes he does some pretty bad things, but he's a very cultivated person, and his reference is the literary space, the language space, that is, in which he was trained. And this is something that we wanted to focus more on. And I don't know how to say this now. No, that's when all the spectacular things started to unfold. And we wanted to go back to these possibilities that I believed were far more interesting and much richer. And, well, I prefer aesthetic practices really as a trend. And for me, art is I don't know if I could use the term Marxist, I think she said. Well, anyway. And I think that this, in the notion of aesthetical practices, offer us a much more open space, a much more unpredictable and much more interesting too. That takes us rapidly to the market, because when you talk about contemporary art, you never talk about a series or a number or a group of significant works or specific works. They talk about the market or a market, and I'd even dare say that it's well, one of the specialized segments of contemporary trade. But any idiot has an idea of what contemporary art is supposed to be about. But this doesn't coincide with my ideas or with my practice, and I have lots of colleagues and friends who have different views too. And as regards the role of cinema, well, it wasn't cinema as such, or filmmaking. And you have people like Antonioni or Rossellini or Godard. We invited Godard to come along. But I think that, well, as we didn't get in touch with him directly, there was a very strong opposition from Beaumont, and a friend of mine called him up and said, well, how come nobody mentioned this to me? And, well, with the rights, this lady could do whatever she wanted with the cinema issue. So they had to articulate the different segments of Documenta in the different buildings and spaces we had. And that wasn't possible because we received permission very late, something like 15 days before the whole thing unfolded. But I wasn't very happy about that. And I decided that the videos were not going to be presented in the Nandram Pavilion, but we were going to present other things. And with that, well, the work was the most visited one. It attracted many more people, and people that were very concentrated on that particular piece too. But going back now, or focusing rather on the exhibition that had, well, you can identify something like 4 thematic lines. One of them was architecture, another one was urbanism or town planning, another one arts and politics, And the cinema, that would be the fourth, and Antigona. And we can also say that these lines have gone beyond the exhibition, and in the long run they've had an impact in terms of contemporary artistic practices. So could you say something, please, about why you chose these concepts and the role they played in the exhibition? Well, the lines that you just pointed out are work lines, and they are not reading lines or lecture lines. And secondly, I think that an exhibition is like theatre, really, because many times it is terrible to discover what the director wanted, and what really matters is what you actually see, which might be only 10% of what the director invested in or wanted. And the organization of the works, well, it was highly constructed, well, contrary to what many people believed. Well, not because it was a very large exhibition does one have to accumulate works as if they were potatoes. You don't have to stack them up. No, you can organize things in a very musical and precise manner. And of course this involves lots of work, and one has to have trust in what's going on, and you must also work with the architects, because if not, things won't work out properly. And here we're talking about a collection of dialogues, and sometimes they are more obvious and sometimes less, but it's, well, urbanism, for instance, that wasn't the issue, but it was rather how some artists, as from the late 50s, how they had thought about the urban space, and they'd studied architects that had worked, that had thought about the internal and external spaces. Do you remember the surname of this guy from Amsterdam? Corinne. And yes, this Dutch architect, the generation from before, Aldun, that's it. Thank you very much, Aldun van Ack. And he was an architect with an anthropological or line of thought. He was a very ambitious guy, and that was extremely nutritional for certain artists. So the issue wasn't about the city and politics, but I think that we had very few artists that were working. I think that what I was never interested in is the notion of what a politician is all about. And when we're talking about poetics and politics, I have an idea of what is political in art that is much closer to Maranné or Beckett than to Wei Wei. In the gesticulation or in the literal processes and the creative processes, I'm not interested in that. And this sometimes they're more aesthetic forms and possibly more efficacious of being militant, but that's not what I'm interested in. I never worked with this concept. This is a completely different space that I'm not interested in, and for my exhibitions, that is. Well, but I'm happier with something that has been thought over carefully or is much more attractive. But I'd say that Wei Wei was a political artist, and that's what I saw in China. But they didn't even really notice what he was doing. But I believe that this is fundamental, because if not, there is, when I spoke to people, there's a sort of a caricature concept, because for me the political issue is what changes the language and what also changes the structures too. It's a very in-depth kind of work, and it's not something that has to do with gesticulation that comes just like that to you. No, it's a very fine or subtle thing, and militancy is a completely different issue, and one can do both things but not simultaneously. That's what I think anyway. And then there's another concept that appears in the book, which is another sediment, which is colonialism. And in a way, well, in the book, terms like post-neocolonialism were introduced. And during yesterday's session, Racial Waste presented the example of the Third Biennial in Havana, that attempt in 1989 of setting up a space that were to challenge the Eurocentrism of contemporary art, and especially that large exhibition scale. And this is also one of the recurrent issues that I think that also is connected to this caricature that you were talking about right now in terms of political issues. And I was wondering, well, it seems that it's as if this were a more incipient moment and not so usual. But I was wondering how you address this issue of colonialism that appears in the book. But I think that in Documenta, well, I think there were some strong expressions of non-Euro-Americans, artists, that is, but I never believed in this, because nobody knows everything and nobody can present the most significant artist in each space. And him, well, let's say that my views were different compared to previous Documenta directors, but I think that we had plenty of time to think these things over, and it's not a time that you should use traveling all over the place like mad. I think that what you have to do is think and reflect upon what you're doing and consider what you already know and try to be a little bit more accurate, a little bit more precise, and more stress the known artists more. I think that the Xica was an absolutely precise presentation with Michelangelo Pistoletto, and who's a lyrical and political artist from the poetic point of view, and Michelangelo Pistoletto, as well, possibly you can see this more and more, and North Americans never understood this, but I think that the first post-Fordian artist who was using these post-Fordian objects that he imposed little by little. And I think that these are two very accurate statements of that time. But people that wanted to see that saw it, and perhaps others were not capable of seeing things that clearly. And the other question was, well, yes, colonialism and all that. Well, I think it was, we started with 1945, which was the liberation of the concentration camps, but it also coincided with Hiroshima, and it was also the beginning of the end of the French colonial empire, with the revolts in Morocco that were repressed ferociously, savagely even. And now that we have more knowledge, and I worked on this years later at Documenta, and I would stress that the main year here is 1945, and the independence of India was declared in 1947, so there are a number of important dates. And without discussing a very polemic issue, I have my ideas, but it's a very, very controversial subject. And I think that 1945 and the closing down of the concentration camps doesn't mean the same thing for everybody, because there are cultural and human spaces where people had other concerns. And I think that this is something that we have to think about very carefully, because if not, we could end up making some mistakes, and we could produce, well, we do have some contemporary repercussions as regards this dischrony. In other words, not always thinking about history and temporalizations as if they were all of them identical. And then the other issue, what I have to say is that this post-colonial issue is something that comes to my mind quite a lot, because I've seen lots of symptoms of neo-colonialism. Well, post-colonial means that we've already left it behind, but I think that first, I think it's a mistake, and secondly, this favours generalizations more than accurate thoughts, and I think that the colonialization process in India didn't produce anything similar to what we can see in certain African countries. So, well, you know, colonization obviously means that we have a certain kind of more or less violent domination, but that doesn't suffice, because you have to analyze things more carefully. And there are many other associations of, well, this is a terminology from the 18th century. It's all about being submissive to somebody or something, or to be at somebody's service, of producing or in making up this absolute submission to something. So we have to see where we stand exactly and stop using these big words and not mix everything up, because well, perhaps the political theory is somewhat different in France, but if we look at the geopolitical and cultural and social situations we have nowadays, it's not the same thing. Not the same thing applies to everybody. So this is something that I never discuss with Indians, at least not in public. But things didn't turn out that badly, and I think that they've profited from several things pretty well, but I wouldn't discuss that in public, of course. I would do so in private, but not in public. No, no way. And not all of them, of course. Well, this morning somebody mentioned this. I think that it was Ivan who spoke about this presence of the Indian academics have achieved a certain degree of post-colonial hegemony, or something along those lines. But if we think about Documenta, it's an event that it's a major event. It's a big exhibition, but let's say it is not about instrumentalizing art or making it spectacular. But in any case, it is a very successful event because it's attracted lots of people. And in '97, which is when you curated Documenta, we've already mentioned this many times on this panel, and that was the year when a museum was opened in this city that did represent this idea of a museum as a company aimed at mass tourism. But what perception was there at that point in time when you were working in relation to that phenomenon? And then another phenomenon that was running in parallel that had to do with the globalization processes that were picking up speed. Well, I think that the Guggenheim Bilbao Museum, I think that it's a practically perfect symptom even. I think I never heard anybody mention an exhibition that was unique or special. And I think that the model was transformed too. Because, how do you say this, the franchise, well, yes, there's a franchise policy, and, well, you can see how the French organized the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. It's like a metastasis, if you want. So there are lots of contemporary metastases, and It is not exactly the same thing, but generically speaking, it's the same kind of dynamics. It's the same energy too. It's the energy that is delivered by capital, because I can't see all that much cultural energy. But when you said, for instance, unfortunately there are no rules or anything of that kind, and there's nobody that can guarantee that Documenta was going to be a success, so this was the responsibility of the selection committee, and it's also the responsibility of all of the directors that were appointed to the organisation. And for me, I think that the most obvious danger would be, or is now, unfortunately, a process in which Documenta is becoming biennial. And Documenta has the luxury of being held every 5 years, but it's not always that time period. It's I think it's 3 years, really, more than anything else, which is a luxury. But now there's a biennalization process underway, and Documenta had its own rhythm, and I'd even dare say that it had its own distances or gaps that are perhaps are becoming more and more difficult to maintain and to impose even. But Documenta, well, there are many problems and many pandemics, but the only thing that could change things drastically would be money, or some kind of policy-related issue. But in any case, this is a luxury, and it does have a certain level of authority. When we did Documenta with Denzel Walkers and myself and many others, we only worked 16 hours a day, and we only focused on Documenta. So, in other words, I think that it deserves this kind of work or this kind of effort too. And it's also an economic and a political problem too. But contrary to what many people think, it is not the highest budget in Europe or the rest of the world. I worked out the figures. Well, I can't give you the figure in euros because in those days we were working things out in Deutschmarks. But in any case, we worked out the figures with Audencia, and we came to a conclusion, and that is, well, it took 5 years of a preparation and everything, and it was, well, nearly the same budget than the São Paulo biennial. So that is very correct, but the very interesting thing of this is that a significant chunk, not everything, let's say that most of the budget, at least at that point in time, came from the local government and national government from Germany, and I think that that was a guarantee of transparency and lots of freedom too, because you know that Germans are very patient people, and they are pretty correct too. As regards debates involving policies of this kind. But that wouldn't be the case in France, unfortunately. Okay, we have one final question, and then perhaps we could then open the floor to the audience here should they want to ask anything that has to do with that relationship between the book and the exhibition. And, well, we have our friend Philip Dack, who's a book designer with whom we've worked in a long-term project based on 5 publications by Marco Brotheitz, because he was one of the designers that has been closely related to these retrospective catalogues and facsimiles too. And we also know, well, you are an expert and you've worked a lot on this. And what are we talking about? Are we talking about the time of books or times of catalogues? It's not the time of the exhibition. And well, this is something that Martel Brotas also used as a format to intervene artistically, which is the strategy that you were talking about before. In other words, of not only documenting what was at the exhibition, but also use the publication of the book as a space for artistic intervention in a complete dimension. And before, you were talking about montage too, developed based on the design of the musical score. It looked like musical composition, something complex, and you worked on that with a team. And I was wondering if these two processes, in other words, if the publishing of the book, which as you said started before you started to work on the installation and the montage, when you were configuring that musical score, were there any cross references between both things? Yes, of course. Yes, of course there were cross references, and well, we could change the works from one place to another, and the architects, well, it was two that were working with us, and it was a very porous affair. And we people had held lots of meetings, at least once a day. Well, it was a progressive process, and sometimes we ran out of time. But anyway, it was a very interesting experience we had with Documenta. And as regards the book, there was this German guy who's now retired, who'd worked with Martha von Gardel, Lothar Haus, and I must say that he was extremely accurate, and page by page. I'd never seen that before. Somebody that worked so carefully. Sometimes he worked quicker and sometimes slower, and there are pages that didn't work out properly, and he had to readdress them. And I think that this is the issue we have in relation to the book. And well, one, understand that we're talking about the two-dimensional space of the book has no connection with the 3D space of the exhibition. It's a completely different space. And for instance, where we had a section, I think that it was called information, and that was a very important line of work too, information. And I remember that things were running very late. I don't know what went wrong. And somebody called me up and said, look, things are going very, very late. What can we do? So he was sent from urbanism to information, because we had to focus much more on information, and he was sent over to that section. And we did this because it's like as if there were a dance. There's a structure, and you know that a structure can guarantee your imagination, and not the other way around. When there's no structure, there's chaos. But with a structure, you can go very far, and you can reach, you can do things until the very end. And in this regard, the book documents the research process. Well, I'm not sure about that. Let's say the documenter documents, but in any case, in the book, it's the total or overall process. What it has, what I would call the points of condensation, and with several chapters on this. Well, I have a curiosity that I was just thinking about during the conversation, and talking about the documents and Documenta, because let's say that in these three presentations, we've spoken about you people. Well, when you think about the past and you think about the personal archive, or let's say what has to do with your own memory archives. And I was remembering that as regards the Documenta archive, I'm not sure whether it was a Miren, that's what I mean, because there was a time when your archive was at Artelecu. Yes, it's still travelling around. Yes, because I think that, well, there are documents that have to be left where they are, and well, it's really, well, if it were only documented, but throughout a lifetime, it's many other things too. And where is that right now? Well, no, it's in several locations. So yes, well, I need you to refresh my memory because I don't know where things are right now. It would be great to have everything in only one location, but that would only make things even more complex. And then one final thing, that when you were talking about the book, I can't remember everything, but there was something that was very clear for everybody when we initiated this process, and that is that Documenta as an institution, well, what does it mean? Well, what does it mean for many people, including many people that will never come along because they either can't make it or because they don't have enough budget or whatever. It could be anything. But from the beginning, we believed that the book was what was going to have longer lasting circulation. So I worked on what I called concentric circles. The book, the 100 days, and we started at the very beginning online, and we had a performance or a discussion or a concert or whatever every night. And this is something that was filmed by a team that was managed by a former assistant of Fassbinder, a great guy, and he uploaded that very late at night. But it was that moment. Well, it was very uncomfortable. We had the VHS tapes available, for instance, for somebody that came along on the 22nd could come along to see what had happened between the 1st and the 21st. But that was in the early stages, of course. And that's in Documenta, in the archives. Well, now we have problems concerning rights. And I'm also afraid that they will also have technical problems too. We didn't think about that enough. We didn't give enough thought, and I think that the time's come when you have to choose or decide between different alternatives. Okay, well, perhaps now we can open the discussion to the floor, if anybody wants to say anything. And invite Corinne and Ines to join us too, perhaps. Perhaps both of them can join us. So Ines and Corinne, could you please step up onto the platform? And could you join us here, please, for the discussion? That's going to be an open discussion with the audience. Well, I have a curiosity. I have a curiosity that I think that all three of you share, and especially in your case, Catherine. But you were using VHS as a documentation format that is not what I would call very durable, really, and that really amazed me. But it does create a documentation structure that I believe forms, it belongs to those days, and which creates a narrative that we are not really accustomed to. I don't know what you think, but I think that it also, the format is also here referring to a way of narrating in the present, which I believe is very beautiful. Microphone, please.
Catherine, it's also because we didn't organize. There is other archives which are organized, and there is a passage of technique generation, and then if you, so personal archive boxes in houses. It's just a reality, and I think that's the thing. And this defending the project, it's difficult. Artists are much more attentive when it comes to their works. I'm not speaking of documentation. Not all, but with a transfer of a technique generation. But then...
But I only made I had the translation of the cassette made for this event here, but I also think Arteleco had made it. And Caterina Borelli, as she's a filmmaker, I'm sure she has all kinds of copies properly stored. So I think even, if it's VHS quality of the time, which I personally really like, it's like deep dish TV or something. I think we can still grasp it. I would be much more interested, on the other hand, to see the footage. That's a different form of archive.
Pero cuando volvemos al tema del archivo, ¿no? Me viene...
Yes, when we go back to the archive issue, well, there's something that I always enjoyed a lot about Michel de Certeau, who was a very important philosopher in the 70s and 80s, and he said in an article that Beauvoir published in one of the good journals we had a long time ago, and that closed, and I can't remember the title of the journal, but I remember the title of the paper by Michel, and he said, archives are hallucinogenic substances.
What do you keep, what you don't keep, and who makes this kind of decision? I mean, Derrida wrote extensively on that, but this question is still an everyday question,
I have two questions. Can I ask one?
Sí, claro.
Because it's coming to an end too, and kind of, especially today, but I think also yesterday, I think the framework of the conference is exhibition, but I had the feeling that it kind of overarching leads institution and questions of institutionalization, and probably that's something that you will grasp on in the next decade. But I think it was always underlyingly there, very specifically in mind, but you all kind of spoke very strongly also about institutional discourses and how they affect exhibition making. So I probably would like to ask the two of you, but then also you mentioned a couple of categories, how the 80s produced a critique of institutions that also then kind of influenced an exhibition making. So I think it's a pretty interesting, albeit really broad subject, but I think I would want to clarify what is our reference system. Probably one question would be in that period, and is that different today?
Yo creo que igual.
Well, I don't know. Perhaps what I was thinking is that when we created the program for the previous decade, the issue of the institution and the institutionalization of the art system was not that present. But in a very obvious manner, perhaps, because this was closer to us from a biographical perspective, but also it was closer in all senses, both chronologically and because of what we've been saying here time and again, that has to do with the local case. And this was something that we saw that was impossible to avoid. And perhaps even in the case of the invitation for Aymar, and we had to think how we addressed the AIDS crisis too, from the point of view of artistic practices. And let's say that we also had the institution present. I don't know. Yes, I think that this also, this was something that it was in the proposal from the very beginning, and which had to do with taking into account the format of the artifact of the exhibition as if it were crystal with lots of edges or corners, something that allows you to see things, but it also produces distortions, or it multiplies things as if it were a prism. It multiplies the image. And I think that the exhibition, well, we wanted to put it to the test as an artifact that would assist us, that would help us to see the past. So it could be exhibitions of other points in time, of exhibitions on what the future, what they consider the future is going to be like, or exhibitions on the past that would allow us to understand the context in which this was situated. But it's equally true that exhibitions also help you see other things, and not only the political context, but also the forms or the institutions that made it possible to have certain exhibitions, and the institutions that we have nowadays that perhaps make it possible to have other kinds of forms of exhibitions and not others. But what is true is that in this decade, what we can see is that there's a way of conceiving an exhibition that is much more open. And you gave the example of urban interventions as an exhibition, or Puente de Pasaje, an exhibition that lasted 1 year, but which necessarily does not have any works in an exhibition space for 365 days, but rather the duration of the exhibition is extended, and all of a sudden production and research are not always visible, are not always exposed, but this is also happening. And I think that this is something that has to do with this decade. So we are putting to the test the format, and the same applies to Documenta 10 too. It's a way of addressing an exhibition that establishes a dialogue with the past, with the recent past, as you were pointing out before.
Momentum.
Yeah, they also try to have a dialogue with the momentum. It was a moment with a high rate of unemployment. Frankfurt was almost the poorest city in Germany, and we could see the decay of the city center. We organized a parcours, so it's like a visit around the city. And that turned into the site of the event, all the way to the river. And I think that we could not call anything an exhibition. I think what Corinne described was rather an event with different times, with different rhythms, and so on and so forth. And I think when you talk about an institution has its issue and so on and so forth, but I think an institution cannot be used an alibi to think of another level that I think is as important as the institution itself. That is the format, precisely, because what I see is that you might go to the Centre Pompidou or to the Modern Art Museum in Prague. You might see the same format time and again, and that is an issue. So I think that what I try to do in Documenta is that this 100 days was an event. I don't like events that are conceived as an exhibition. You get there and you don't know whether something is done or starting. And I think if you use the right panels or boards, or you indicate the times, because otherwise you get there and there's lots of confusion. Whether you don't know whether that is an event that is about to finish or to start. So I think there are different formats, but I think they should be adapted to the discourse the artist would like to provoke. And I think that is also responsibility. It is not only an institutional issue. When you are in China for some days, I think it is very weird that nobody says that there is a total chaos. And that happens usually in contemporary spaces, but in national or institutional spaces that are managed or controlled more or less by the Ministry of Culture, or, well, something like, by the government somehow, everything is more organized. So I think we can also consider that things have to be very well done, and some directors are not apparatchi, but they're professionals. Something is the institution and something else is the format. I think there is this power of, controlling the masses and so, there's this issue now that we're making people be less and less educated, and I think that is being seen in China and also much in official exposition sites or spaces.
What has happened in the last 15 years about what I call the desperate desire of museum for performances.
Yeah, totally.
In terms of these questions, exhibition, formats, institution, non-institution, times, this desperate desire, which I will not here, but it's I think very problematic regarding your question.
Sí. Y no solo los museos, pero también las bienales, ¿no?
That's also the case in Bahia, in the Biennale.
But I think has moved from also the piece into something else.
Yeah,
into the curator and the institution as well. Before, our perception and our reading of something was a piece, an artist and his work. That has totally changed, right? It's a gesture that you make that rereads an object.
But for an artist, it still is in the work.
Yes.
The thing is that the moment is very difficult. It's not a time for everything is made for having people not spending the necessary time. It's not. And I feel because cada vez que uno quiere presentar un trabajo un poco.
Every time one want to present a complex work, it's very difficult because people don't have time, they don't have the intellectual capacity or the sensibility. It's like Mallarmé. It is not about learning two verses. It is the whole machine that is different. It is a high-level political act. That is the work on Rancière, that very well-known and sophisticated poet. And he's one of the most political one in the end of 19th century. So I think political work is a deeply political work, because it works like Beckett. It's got nothing to do with transparency. I think there is a paradox here, and I think many artists are able to keep this level. I think it is more about the confusion in between the space of a work and of an artwork. I think often even fashion is more meaningful and more precise than some current artistic practices, and also it is even more ambitious. Questions?
Joaquín se mueve.
Joaquín, sí, tal vez está ahí.
Cansados ya.
Yo no veo nada.
Yo tampoco
Ya.
veo ahí.
Vemos
pero
poco.
no.
Bueno, pues no sé. ¿Queréis decir alguna otra cosa?
Would you like to add something? Inés?
Is there wine today as well? So.
You have to go to the bar.
Go to a place with wine, my favorite idea.
Pero si queréis acompañarnos también
Sí.
y seguir la conversación de manera más informal, ¿no? Podemos
No
también.
somos muchos, con lo cual
Sí.
sí, cabremos en un bar.
Bueno, pues lo dejamos aquí. Muchísimas gracias a todas y a todos también por...
Los pobres que se han quedado.
Y bueno, y muchísimas gracias, por supuesto, Azcuna Centroa por apoyar este proyecto desde hace 3 años ya. Y,
Sí, y que esperemos que, bueno, poder vernos en el próximo encuentro, que lo más seguro será en 2020 ya. Vale. Es que recasco.
yo creo que nos hemos ajustado el tiempo.
Sí, yo creo que sí. Yo creo que sí.